Chapter 48, From Selma to Montgomery. The tension in Selma was awful. Marchers and even reporters covering the marches were being roughed up and beaten. Where could they go for protection? Not to the police. The police and the state troopers were doing most of the beating. When 82-year-old Cager Lee marched, a state trooper went for him and whipped him until he was bloody. Jimmy Lee Jackson, Cager's grandson, carried his grandfather into a cafe. But the troopers weren't finished. They stormed right into that cafe. One trooper hit Jimmy's mother, and another shot Jimmy Lee Jackson in his stomach. He died 7 days later. That murder was too much for civil rights workers to bear. They felt responsible. There was no stopping them now. The murder was almost too much for some of Selma's white citizens. 70 of them marched in sympathy to the courthouse. 600 people, men, women, and children, mostly black, some white, gathered at Brown's Chapel. They were prepared to march 58 miles from Selma to Alabama's capital, Montgomery. They intended to face Governor George Wallace and demand that all of Alabama's citizens be protected in their right to vote. Jose Williams, a young firebrand, was in charge. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Washington consulting with the president. First they prayed, and then they began their march, singing as they went. The march started 6 blocks from Brown's Chapel to the Edmund Pettus Bridge. No one stopped them. All was quiet except for their voices. They knew that once they crossed the bridge, they would be on the road to Montgomery. But when they mounted the sloping crest of the bridge, they were stunned by what they saw. Alabama state troopers were lined up, gas masks in place, bullwhips and billy clubs raised. The troopers didn't give anyone time to decide what to do. They moved forward. Some were riding on horseback, some on foot. Then they released tear gas bombs. 8-year-old Cheyenne Webb said, "I saw people being beaten and I tried to run home as fast as I could. I saw horses behind me. Jose Williams picked me up and I told him to put me down. He wasn't running fast enough." But something new had come to this out-of-the-way southern town. That something was television coverage. Camera crews were filming the action. Television stations across the nation interrupted their regular program to show the scenes of policemen on horseback clubbing peaceful marchers. How would you feel if you watched that on television? Most good people were sickened. So when Martin Luther King Jr. sent telegrams to prominent clergymen saying, "Join me for a minister's march to Montgomery," ministers came from many places, many faiths. White-beard Rabbi Abraham Heschel came from the Jewish Theological Seminary. From the United Nations came world leader Ralph Bunchy. He too had won a Nobel Peace Prize. And a Unitarian minister, James Reeb, came from Boston. Reeb did not go back to Boston. The nightmare of brutality wasn't quite finished in Selma. Reeb and some other white ministers made the mistake of eating in a black cafe. For Reeb, it was a fatal mistake. He was clubbed to death when he came out of the restaurant. President Johnson was shocked and said, "What happened in Selma was an American tragedy. At times, history and fate meet in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was at Lexington and Concord. So it was a century ago at Potomac's. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama." The president announced he was sending a voting rights bill to Congress. Then he spoke to the 70 million people who listened on television. "It's not just Negroes," he said. "It's really all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And he finished with these words from the Civil Rights theme song: "We shall overcome." "We were all sitting together," said a black leader who heard the president speak. And Martin was very quietly sitting in the chair, and a tear ran down his cheek. It was a victory like none other. 6 days later, 4,000 people, black and white, marched from the Pettus Bridge in Selma to Montgomery, camping out at night and singing songs of freedom. This time, National Guardsmen protected them. By the time they reached the Capitol, 25,000 people had joined the march. Rosa Parks were there, and so were many of those 10 years earlier had walked through the winter bluster and summer's heat rather than ride Montgomery's segregated buses. Martin Luther King Jr. had been an unknown preacher. Now he was world famous.